Most of us think we're good listeners. We're not. We're good repliers. Hey leader, David Burkus here, organizational psychologist and best-selling author of 5 books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever. One of the most common complaints among disengaged employees, members of the team who are burned out, who are barely bringing it in, what we might call quiet quitting, and whose productivity shows it. One of their biggest complaints is that they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling seen, they're not being recognized. We want to be seen for who we are and what we offer that team. And that means it is a leader's job to help most people feel heard. People approach you as a leader with their ideas, with their potential problems, with their feedback, or even with the times that they disagree, and how you respond in that moment sets the tone for whether or not they truly feel heard, whether or not they feel seen, whether or not they have a sense of psychological safety where they can bring their whole selves to work, where they can share those ideas that might be divergent, but that make the team better because they're diverse. All of that comes from how leaders often respond and how they teach others on the team to respond when someone is trying to make themselves heard. And by the way, as a leader, whatever you're about to say in response to them, the success of it depends on how heard they feel. Otherwise, they're just going to discount what you say. If you didn't take the time to listen to what they were truly saying and you were just trying to formulate a response, why should they take the time to listen to that response? So in this episode, we're going to talk about 5 ways that leaders can help people feel heard, help them feel seen, and let them know that they offer something unique and meaningful to the team and the work the team is doing. Let's get started. So the first way to help people feel heard is to model active listening. Make sure that they know in the moment that you are truly listening to them, that you're not staring at your phone or your email inbox if it's a Zoom or a Teams or some kind of video call. Make sure they feel like you're actually dialed into what they have to say and processing what they're trying to tell you. You know, the communication expert Julian Treasure presents what he calls this great acronym called RASA, R-A-S-A, to help people understand whether or not they're actively listening. Now, the undergrad English major in me knows that it's actually an acrostic and not an acronym, but the lesson is still amazing. RASA, receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. When someone is talking to you, are you receiving what they have to say? Are you really trying to get all of that information, or are you just trying to reply? You know, most of us think we're good listeners, but we're not. We're good repliers. We spend the time that we're not talking thinking about what we're going to say. Receiving involves not doing that, but actually focusing in on receiving what they're saying. Appreciate, the second letter in the acrostic RASA. Appreciate, meaning those little nonverbals. Are you nodding your head? Are you leaning forward at them? Are you giving those ums and ahs, those little gestures and utterances that signal that you're really in it and you want them to say more? Summarize. Before you say anything, can you do the third element of RASA? Summarize what you just heard them say. Now you could use something formulaic like what I hear you saying, or it sounds like you're saying this, but really anything you use to signal that you are in it, that you received it, and here's what you got from it is going to be incredibly useful. So can you summarize it? And then lastly, before you offer anything else, can you ask them follow-up questions? Tell me more, and what else? What happened before that? Or what's your approach to this situation been? Any of those questions not only signal that you're in it and listening, they signal that you want to hear more. And that helps them feel heard because obviously, if you heard them, that's why you want to hear more. The second way to make people feel heard is to praise their contribution. Yeah, that's right. Even if it's an idea you totally disagree with, even if it's something that's sort of absolutely crazy, even if it's them disagreeing with you, the fact that they're speaking up means they're making a contribution to the team. They're sharing the benefit of their experience, their perspectives, right? All of the things that they bring to what is hopefully a diverse team, they're sharing in that moment. And before you do anything else, praise them for that contribution. Especially when people are sharing something that's particularly vulnerable. when they're talking about a potential weakness or an area they need help, or when they're admitting a failing, and as a result, the team is going to learn from that failing, that's when it's really important to thank them for that contribution. Hey, thank you so much for bringing that in. You might even tag this into your summary section of RASA. Thank you so much for contributing. It sounds like what you're saying is this, and I loved this part of it. All of those things you do to praise the fact that they spoke up, praise the fact that they offered that contribution, means, number one, they're going to contribute more. Number two, everyone watching is going to want to contribute more. And number three, and the most important, they're going to feel heard. Because if you didn't hear them, why would you be praising their contribution? The third way to make people feel heard is to question assumptions, not ideas. Look, it's going to happen. Sometimes you're going to praise the contribution and still disagree with it. Sometimes you're going to have to actively listen to someone who's presenting an idea in conflict with yours. Sometimes you're going to have to push back on the idea. When you do, make sure that you do not, certainly that you do not criticize the person, but that you don't criticize the idea. It makes very little sense to praise the contribution and then directly criticize the contribution. Right? Thank you so much for speaking up. Also, you're an idiot. That's not going to go over well at all. So instead, ask questions about the assumptions behind the idea. Humans are logical some of the time, right? We arrive at our conclusions and our ideas based on the logical thought process we went through based on our perspectives, our experiences, our assumptions about the world. And so if you and I disagree, it's not because you're illogical and I'm logical or vice versa. It's because you have a different set of assumptions, a different perspective than I do. And so the way you're going to find common ground, explore that idea further, and maybe even determine whose idea is the one of best fit for this situation is by having a conversation about the assumptions underneath the idea. So if you're gonna push back, you're still praising them for the contribution, but if you're gonna push back, you're gonna say, that's a really great idea. What I hear in all of this is that it sounds like you're assuming we have this amount of budget. Or you could even ask, have you thought about how much this might actually cost? Because I wanna make sure that we have the budget for it, right? That's totally different, and it's received totally different than, that'll never work, we can't afford it. So question the assumptions behind the idea, and that's a way of not only pushing back on the idea, but still praising them for that contribution to the idea and helping them feel heard. The fourth way to make people feel heard is to ask questions before offering advice. And we sort of talked about this a bit in number one and in this idea of RASA, but that's a more generic tell me more. What I mean here is that we want to really dive into the problem before we offer our advice. So this is specific in those situations when people are coming to us with a problem, with a situation, when they actually want our advice. They don't want our advice quite yet. They want to feel heard first. And the way that you help them feel heard is to ask them questions. The other reason this works so well, right? You have to be receiving what you're hearing in order to ask intelligent questions. But the other reason this works so well is that when people come to you with their problem, when they come to you with a situation they're facing, they're not actually coming to you with the problem. They're coming to you with the extent of the problem that they trust admitting to you. When someone admits that they failed or that something's going awry, they're not actually taking total responsibility right off the bat, unless you already have a high level of trust with that person. Instead, they're coming to you with the level of vulnerability, the level of the problem, the level of the failure that they feel comfortable sharing with you. And they're testing you in that moment. And if you jump right in and offer your advice and tell them how to solve that problem, you're actually not giving them the right advice because you're solving a smaller problem than what's really there. But more importantly, you're not showing them that you're a safe person to have these conversations with, that you still value them even when they fail. In fact, you value their transparency because we all learn from that. So you're going to ask follow-up questions, specific questions aimed at going upstream of the problem, upstream of the situation, and exploring it further. And by the way, half the time you do that, you're never even going to have to give advice. Because as we discuss what's going on upstream, sometimes the solutions just become apparent. But even if you do have to say, hey, here's how I would do it, or here's what I think you should do, they're going to listen to that much more often because they felt heard as they were sharing that problem. And the fifth and final way to make people feel heard is to always follow the rule of addition before subtraction. In other words, what can you add? What can you praise? What can you compliment before what can you criticize? And we're not talking here about the compliment sandwich and having these vague pieces of compliments. We're talking about the idea, what you just heard and what you just received. Share what was positive about it first before you push back on anything or ask questions or offer any kind of criticism. When someone's admitting their failure, pivot to the lessons first before you talk about the corrective things they need to do to make amends for that failure. Always look to be adding before subtracting for a couple different reasons. I mean, number one, it's going to help people feel heard because you're hearing the positive things in them, not just pivoting right to criticism. Number two, it's going to help them receive that criticism better because they know your heart is true, your heart is good, that you care about them, and that's why you noticed all of these things. And number three, and perhaps the most important, is that often just the addition is enough. You know, I'm a big fan of giving people feedback that follows in the format of, what I liked was this, even better if. In other words, I'm not subtracting at all. I'm actually offering my criticism or my correction in a way that builds off of what I already like. And there's a whole wealth of research around appreciative inquiry, as it's often called, where you can move somebody to much greater levels of performance by helping them build on their strengths and build on their positives, and in the process correcting their weaknesses, than just focusing in on their weaknesses. And that's probably a good way to summarize everything we've been talking about in this episode. People don't feel heard when either you're tuned out, you're not actively listening, or when they feel like all you've done is seen the negatives in them from that. So if you start from a place of actively listening to them, praising their contribution, right? Asking questions about assumptions, not just going right to a criticism of the ideas, and asking questions before you offer advice, and even adding on to their ideas and the positive you saw in their ideas before going to that criticism, they're gonna feel heard because they're gonna feel like you actually get what they bring to the table. It's not about whether or not you downloaded the message. That's just the start. It's about whether or not you appreciated what they brought to the table when they shared that message. People want to do work that matters. We talk about that all the time here in this community, but they want to work for leaders who tell them they matter. And if you can help them feel heard, you're telling them they matter. And when they feel like they matter, they're gonna give you more effort, gonna give you better ideas, and are gonna be more motivated and are gonna be greater team players. And that's gonna help everyone on your team not only be heard, but do their best work ever. Oh, and one more thing. When you engage in this, you're often gonna have to use all of these tools for when ideas are in conflict. And that's okay. Conflict gets a bad rap. And if you're wondering why I say that, you're probably gonna wanna check out this video here on the surprising benefits of conflict at work.